So imagine, just for a second, that you're holding a resource in your hands that the entire world absolutely desperately needs.
Right, like the exact material required just to literally keep the lights on globally.
Exactly. But getting this resource out of the ground and then, successfully navigating it across the globe is basically this daily, incredibly complex geopolitical obstacle course.
Oh, absolutely.
You are looking at severe supply chain bottlenecks, skyrocketing production costs, shifting global conflicts, and honestly, Western buyers who are starting to just completely panic.
Yeah, panic is definitely the right word for it right now.
And at the absolute center of this geopolitical obstacle course is one single company, which is Kazatomprom. So today, we're doing a deep dive into a really remarkably revealing 2026 interview transcript.
Yeah, it's a fascinating document.
It features Dastin Kosherbayev. He's a key executive over at Kazatomprom, and he's speaking with industry observer Jimmy Connor. Our mission today is to figure out how the world's largest uranium producer is, well, essentially weaponizing supply and demand and shifting the entire global energy landscape.
But real quick, before we jump into their strategy, just as a quick reminder for you listening, today's source material obviously touches heavily on some very sensitive global geopolitical conflicts.
Right, ranging from Eastern Europe to the Middle East.
Exactly. And we are strictly unpacking Kazatomprom's perspective here, their operational reality. As they outline it in this text, we're not endorsing any political viewpoints. We are just analyzing how these global tensions impact the raw mathematics of the uranium market.
And I got to say, the mathematics here are just staggering. I mean, Kazatomprom's footprint is so massive that what they decide to do basically dictates the baseline for the entire global nuclear energy market.
Yeah, they aren't just participating in the market. They are the center of gravity.
Completely.
Yeah.
And Dastin outlines their 2026 guidance in this interview, projecting this massive 27,500 to 29,000 tons.
Which is huge. That translates to roughly, 71 to 75 million pounds of uranium?
Right. They are aiming for a consecutive record-breaking year, coming right off the highest recorded production out of Kazakhstan last year. But hitting those numbers hinges entirely on overcoming this one severe, highly specific chemical bottleneck.
The sulfuric acid shortage.
Yes.
To really understand why this is a crisis, you have to look at how Kazatomprom actually gets the uranium out of the earth, because they don't dig massive traditional open pit mines.
Right. It's not what people picture when they think of mining.
No, not at all. They utilize a process called in situ recovery, or ISR, and this involves pumping vast amounts of chemical solutions down into the ore body underground to basically dissolve the uranium.
Okay.
And then they pump that uranium-rich solution back up to the surface. And sulfuric acid is the primary leaching agent they use for this entire process.
So think of the sulfuric acid kind of like the specific solvent you need to get a deep, stubborn stain out of a carpet, right? You aren't ripping the whole carpet out of the floor to clean it.
Exactly.
You just pour a highly specific chemical into the fibers to detach the material you want so you can pull it up to the surface. Kazatomprom has the absolute richest uranium, or the carpet, but they are highly dependent on the global market for that solvent.
And the source material clarifies a really important nuance about this dependence. It isn't a physical shortage of acid.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the sulfuric acid molecules exist globally in massive quantities. The bottleneck is strictly economic. It's driven by prohibitive pricing.
Oh, right.
And the price shock actually traces back to the geopolitical conflicts that kicked off around 2022. Because fertilizer producers suddenly needed to procure massive amounts of sulfur and acid to secure their own supply chains.
Wow, so they're competing with agriculture.
Exactly. When global agriculture starts aggressively competing for the exact same raw chemical needed for uranium extraction, the price of that acid just skyrockets.
So it's a pure bidding war between food security and energy security.
Yep.
And Kazatomprom is actively engineering their way out of this bidding war, which is wild. Dastin notes they are in the process of building a third, fully in-house sulfuric acid plant.
Yeah, and I love how he jokes in the interview that basically everything that could have gone wrong already went wrong with the initial deadlines.
Which is such a rare moment of corporate candor, right?
Yeah.
Usually they just spin it. But they are fully on track for the first quarter of 2027.
And once that plant goes online, they effectively neutralize the risk. I mean, they transition to being almost entirely self-sufficient, meaning they never have to fight the fertilizer industry for their leaching agent ever again.
That's incredible.
It is a massive capital allocation, but it's totally designed to eliminate a single point of failure in their supply chain.
Right, but building an entirely new in-house chemical plant isn't cheap. And when you are forced to front significant capital to solve a supply chain bottleneck, while simultaneously, buying inflated asset on the open market in the interim, it fundamentally alters your bottom line.
Oh, absolutely. The costs are jumping.
Yeah, let's look at how this is blowing up their cost structure. Their all-in sustaining costs are taking a massive hit, jumping from $29.53 a pound last year to a projected $35 to $36.50 a pound this year.
That's a huge leap.
Yeah, even the baseline C1 cash costs are hitting the $23 to $25 range.
And those year-over-year jumps are severe. But Dastan attributes this to two primary factors. The first is just standard global inflation across materials and labor. Everything costs more.
Right, standard stuff. What's the second?
The second is entirely regulatory. It's sweeping changes to the mineral extraction tax, or the MITI. For years, Kazatomprom enjoyed a relatively favorable tax regime, kind of insulated from the heavy taxation the Kazakh government applies to its oil industry.
Right. But the government is looking at the worldwide structural deficit in uranium. They're looking at the skyrocketing demand and effectively declaring that, well, uranium is the new oil.
Precisely. They want the exact same sovereign wealth generation from nuclear fuel that they've historically gotten from petrochemicals.
Which forces a major adjustment for Kazatomprom's balance sheet.
Mm-hmm. But, I really have to challenge something Dastan says regarding this in the text.
Oh, what part?
In the interview, he explicitly calls these new tax changes fair. He claims he is never tired of conveying this message, that it's completely fair for the government to take a bigger cut. I struggle to believe a massive profit-driven corporation ever actually sits around the boardroom celebrating a massive new tax hike as a victory for fairness.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Isn't this just highly pragmatic diplomacy?
You really have to view that statement through the lens of operating a state-backed entity in a resource-rich jurisdiction. Diplomacy is quite literally a line item on their operational budget.
Ah, that makes sense. Right, so acknowledging a heavy tax as fair is just the mechanism for publicly aligning the corporation's success with the host nation's success. It is the unavoidable toll you pay to keep the regulatory roads open in a highly lucrative, stable jurisdiction.
Because the alternative is what? Fighting them.
Exactly. The alternative, fighting the sovereign government over extraction rights, is significantly more expensive than the tax itself.
Yeah, so fair essentially translates to accepting the realities of the sandbox they dominate.
Exactly.
Because once they pull the ore out of the ground, and once they pay those newly calibrated taxes, they still face the most complex logistical challenge of all the physical uranium actually has to leave Kazakhstan.
And in 2026, global shipping for radioactive material is an absolute high-wire act.
The interview dives deep into how these geopolitical crosscurrents dictate their logistics. Like, Dastan points out the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, keeping oil prices, specifically WTI and Brent crude, trading firmly above $100 a barrel.
Right, and while Kazatomprom isn't directly involved in the Middle East at all, the auxiliary costs bleed into their operations in unexpected ways.
Like how?
Well, we mentioned the in-situ recovery process earlier, right?
Yeah, the chemical pumping.
Pumping those chemical solutions underground requires thousands of miles of specialized plastic piping. And that plastic is derived entirely from oil products.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't have even thought of that.
Yeah, so when crude stays above $100 a barrel for sustained periods, the manufacturing cost for every single inch of the physical infrastructure required to mine uranium just quietly compounds.
It's a perfect domino effect.
Mm-hmm.
But the piping is honestly just an operational headache. The shipping routes are the real logistical nightmare here.
Oh, total nightmare.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict has made the traditional northern route through St. Petersburg a massive liability, or honestly, an outright impossibility for many Western buyers.
Right, which forces this industry-wide pivot to the Trans-Caspian International Trade Route, commonly known as the TITR.
Now, I struggle to believe the math Dastan presents on this Trans-Caspian route. Bypassing an established massive direct shipping port like St. Petersburg to piece together a multimodal route. I mean, putting material on trains, loading it onto ferries across a landlocked sea, moving it through the Caucasus, and finally getting it to the Black Sea that has to be financially punitive.
You would think so, yeah.
But Dastan claims the costs are highly comparable. How is that even possible?
Well, he specifically calls out the market assumptions on this, noting that rumors of the TITR being tenfold more expensive are entirely false.
Really? Tenfold.
That was the rumor. But the reality of freight economics is that once you scale a route and commit dedicated infrastructure to it, the cost per unit drops dramatically.
Economy of scale.
Exactly. It takes slightly more time, absolutely. But financially, the barrier is nowhere near what analysts assumed. It has transitioned rapidly from an emergency alternative to a primary scaled artery.
He even mentions that there have been recent years where the Trans-Caspian route carried over 50% of their deliveries to the West.
Yeah, and some clients are now contractually mandating this route to avoid St. Petersburg entirely, and Kazatomprom is just seamlessly absorbing that multimodal complexity.
Their operational resilience is just incredible. I mean, they secure the ore, they are building their own chemical plants to bypass the fertilizer industry, they are absorbing inflation and state taxes, and they have successfully mapped entirely new global shipping arteries.
They've been busy.
Seriously.
Yeah.
The physical supply chain is locked down. But to me, the most fascinating part of this interview isn't the logistics. It's the outright market psychology at the very end of that supply chain.
Oh, yeah. The behavioral gap between Eastern and Western buyers is massive.
Let's analyze the Eastern strategy first. Dastan explicitly states that Eastern fuel buyers are thinking in terms of decades, or maybe even centuries.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. They aren't looking at quarterly energy demands. They're looking at generational infrastructure.
Right.
They are aggressively procuring material and basically vacuuming up every pound of supply they can secure.
And the primary evidence for this in the source is the massive procurement deal recently struck with India. Under Kazakh legislation, deals that cross a specific financial threshold actually must be publicly disclosed.
Oh, so they couldn't keep it a secret even if they wanted to.
Exactly. This India deal triggered that legislative requirement, and Dastan confirms the value is comparable to a major legacy deal announced by Cameco.
Which is huge. When an Eastern sovereign buyer locks up a Cameco-sized chunk of the world's largest producer, that sends an undeniable signal to the market. But the West has historically just ignored those signals.
Completely ignored them.
Dastan uses this incredibly sharp analogy to describe Western utilities. He compares them to a frog sitting in a pan of water, completely unaware that the heat is slowly turning up to a boil.
It is the absolute definition of complacency. Western buyers have maintained what Dastan diplomatically terms elevated interest.
Elevated interest. What does that even mean in practice?
It means they hold meetings, they discuss the structural deficit, but they consistently fail to execute concrete long-term procurement contracts. They've just operated for years on the assumption that the spot price would eventually drop and that surplus supply would magically materialize whenever they decided they finally needed it.
That's terrifying. I mean, if you are sitting in the United States right now listening to this, your local power grid requires roughly 50 to 60 million pounds of uranium every single year just to maintain baseline nuclear output.
Right.
Do you know how much uranium was physically produced in the U.S. in 2024? 1 million pounds.
Wow.
Yeah. And the best case scenario for 2025 might be 2 million pounds.
Yeah.
You are completely, almost existentially reliant on the exact global supply chains we're analyzing right now.
And a domestic deficit of that magnitude really transforms standard market complacency into a stark national security vulnerability. I mean, you cannot fuel a reactor on elevated interest.
Yeah, exactly. So at what point does the frog finally realize it's boiling?
Well, according to the timeline in the source, that realization hit hard in the first quarter of 2026. Dastan reveals a sudden, dramatic shift in tone from the West.
What happened?
So Kazatomprom maintains a corporate office in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. And suddenly, that specific office is fielding unusually high levels of direct engagement from U.S. state bodies.
Like government officials.
Yeah. The administration is bypassing standard utility buyers and suddenly demonstrating deep, urgent concern over the security of sovereign supply.
So the panicked phone calls are finally happening.
Yes, they are.
The West is waking up to the reality that the spot price isn't crashing. The structural deficit is real, and Eastern buyers are actively hoarding the long-term contracts the West assumed would always just be waiting for them. If you are Kazatomprom, the setup is perfect. You have Western governments panic calling your D.C. office, and you have Eastern buyers throwing century-minded contracts at your headquarters. The obvious standard corporate move is to open the floodgates, dig up as much ore as humanly possible, flood the market, and cash in on the frenzy while the prices are sky high.
Right, you would expect a maximization of immediate revenue. But Kazatomprom is enforcing a rigidly disciplined strategy they refer to as value over volume.
Meaning they're intentionally refusing to flood the market.
Yes. Dasaton is unequivocal on this point. Their economic model dictates that pounds of uranium left in the ground will mathematically appreciate in value.
Oh, wow. So they see the ground as a bank vault.
Exactly. Producing at maximum capacity merely to satisfy panicked short-term demand degrades their long-term sovereign wealth. They are deliberately keeping supply tight relative to their absolute maximum production capabilities.
It is a brilliant play. Think of
Yeah.
this strategy kind of like a legacy luxury watchmaker, right? They could easily build 10 times the number of watches to meet current demand and sell them all tomorrow.
Right, but they don't.
Exactly. By artificially constraining the output and refusing to overproduce, they maintain immense prestige and unshakable long-term pricing power. Kazatomprom refuses to act like a bulk discount retailer trying to hit quarterly sales quotas. They are managing a finite, indispensable global asset.
And they have the operational swagger to back it up, too. They boast a 28-year flawless delivery record without a single contractual default.
That's insane in this industry.
It really is. That discipline allows them to dictate terms to the entire market. But, there's a secondary, deeply domestic reason for this value over volume approach.
Oh, what is it?
They are looking inward. The source highlights that Kazakhstan is in the process of planning and constructing its own domestic nuclear power plants.
So they have to secure their own grid first.
Yeah, precisely. Kazatomprom cannot simply export every ounce of their national wealth. They must reserve significant, guaranteed chunks of future production to ensure Kazakhstan's own energy independence in the coming decades.
And beyond just keeping some ore at home, they are fundamentally rethinking what it is they are actually selling. This was honestly the most profound revelation in the interview for me. They no longer want to just pull raw rocks out of the ground and hand them over to someone else to finish the job.
Right, the expansion downstream. Destin explicitly states that the market should expect news regarding Kazatomprom diversifying directly into the nuclear fuel cycle.
Which is a huge shift.
Massive. They are actively evaluating the economic viability of moving beyond the role of a raw materials provider and stepping into processing and enrichment.
To put that in perspective, it's the difference between being the farmer who grows raw coffee beans and sells them in bulk for pennies versus owning the premium global cafe chain where you roast the beans, brew the espresso, and sell the finished cup for 10 times the margin.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. If Kazatomprom begins processing and enriching the ore, basically controlling the downstream fuel cycle, they capture exponentially more value from every single pound they mine.
It represents a total evolution of their corporate identity. They transition from a premier mining operation into an end-to-end global energy utility provider.
Let's bring all of this together, because if you are tracking energy markets, geopolitical shifts, or just trying to understand the baseline stability of the global electrical grid over the next decade, uranium is no longer a sleepy, predictable commodity.
Not at all.
We are watching a historic structural reorganization of global energy. You have physical extraction bottlenecks forcing companies to build massive in-house chemical infrastructure.
Yeah.
You have sovereign governments aggressively rewriting tax codes to capture the wealth of the new oil.
Yep.
You have multimodal transcontinental shipping routes replacing traditional ports. And above all, you have a frantic delayed awakening among Western governments who are realizing they are decades behind the procurement strategies of the East.
And through all of this, Kazatomprom is enforcing a fiercely disciplined, value-driven supply strategy.
Exactly. They are holding the resource the world needs, and they are methodically rewriting the rules on how the world is allowed to access it.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question to mull over today. If mega producers like Kazatomprom successfully execute this transition, moving from just pulling ore out of the ground to completely controlling the downstream enriched fuel cycle, does the traditional spot price of raw uranium even matter anymore?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or are we rapidly entering an era where critical nuclear fuel is no longer traded on open, transparent markets, but is instead strictly allocated behind closed doors through sovereign nation-to-nation relationships?
It completely changes the game.
It really does. Something to think about the next time you assume the power grid will just naturally provide. Because having the material is one thing, but controlling the finished fuel is absolute power. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.